Stoic Philosophy Meets Psychology, Unbreakable Mind Edition. What if the only reason your mind keeps breaking is that you built it on beliefs that collapse the moment reality stops caring about your feelings? This question is a threat, and that is why most people run from it. But if you stay, you will understand the truth every Stoic and every psychologist tried to warn you about. Your suffering is not random. It is engineered by the stories you tell yourself when life becomes heavier than your discipline. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the mind becomes its own tyrant when it refuses to confront what is true. Jung exposed that the emotions you avoid become the forces that rule you from the shadows. You think you are overwhelmed by circumstances. You are overwhelmed by the parts of yourself you never learned to control. The world is not interested in your comfort. It is interested in exposing your weak points with perfect precision. Every disappointment, every collapse, every moment of pressure is a measurement of your inner architecture. Most people interpret these signals as punishment. They call it unfair, exhausting, unbearable. It is none of those things. It is instruction. It is a blueprint showing you exactly where your structure fails. Yet instead of reinforcing the foundation, you numb the alarms. You drown them in distractions, excuses, and blind optimism. You protect fragility as if it were identity. Then you wonder why everything hurts. Schopenhauer said that most people mistake avoidance for wisdom. They convince themselves that stepping back is strategy. They ignore the cost of that retreat. The mind grows weaker each time it refuses confrontation. Seneca insisted that adversity does not create weakness. It reveals it. Nietzsche went further. He claimed that the one who cannot endure truth will always be dominated by it. This is the territory you are stepping into now. The collision between Stoic detachment and psychological depth forces one outcome. You either gain command over your perception, or your perception destroys you. This video is not designed to inspire you. It is designed to expose you, to show you the uncomfortable mechanics of how your thoughts shape your reality, how your fears dictate your behavior, and how your inner narrative becomes the prison you keep renovating. If you understand what is breaking you, you can rebuild yourself into something life cannot distort. If you refuse, the same patterns will return with greater force. They always do. The question now is simple. Will you keep repeating the collapse, or will you let this be the moment your mind stops being negotiable? You think the world is attacking you, yet the real assault comes from inside. Every reaction you fail to command becomes a weapon turned against you. This is the battlefield Marcus Aurelius described when he warned that the mind shapes everything it touches. You mistake events for enemies when the actual enemy is the lens you use to interpret them. Stoicism and psychology agree on this with unsettling precision. Reality is neutral. Your perception is not. The pain you feel is amplified by the meaning you attach to what happens. Jung called this the tyranny of the unconscious, the silent machinery that pushes your emotions forward before your reason has a chance to intervene. Most people try to change life before they change the framework they use to experience it. That is why they stay trapped. They negotiate with circumstances instead of negotiating with their own impulses. They demand fairness from a world that owes them nothing. They cling to the illusion that control lives outside when every Stoic already explained the opposite. Epictetus taught that freedom begins where attachment ends. Schopenhauer went further and claimed that suffering multiplies when the will refuses to align with the truth. Yet people prefer the fantasy of control over the discipline required to master it. The first step toward an unbreakable mind is brutal honesty about where your attention goes. Your attention is the doorway through which weakness enters. Every time you let anxiety define the moment, you surrender control. Every time you let fear dictate the next choice, you reinforce the pattern that keeps you fragile. You cannot build a stable mind while feeding the mechanisms that unbalance it. You must learn to see your triggers without obeying them. You must confront your impulses without collapsing beneath them. This is the intersection where Stoicism and psychology merge into a single command. Own your perception, or your perception owns you. Here is the truth most people avoid. The mind does not break because pressure is too heavy. It breaks because the structure carrying it was never reinforced. If you understand this, you can begin to rebuild the inner ground you stand on. If you ignore it, life will continue to expose every crack until you can no longer pretend you are fine. Your emotions were never the problem. Your obedience to them is. Every time you let a feeling dictate your behavior, you surrender the one thing a human being cannot afford to lose: agency. Seneca warned that uncontrolled emotion turns a person into a slave long before chains ever touch the skin. Modern psychology confirms it. When fear spikes, the rational mind shuts down and the primitive mind takes command, steering your actions with impulses designed for survival, not clarity. You call it being overwhelmed. But what overwhelms you is not intensity. It is unexamined emotion, allowed to operate without supervision. People imagine that emotional sensitivity makes them deep. It does not. Depth comes from being able to witness an emotion without collapsing under it. Jung insisted that what you refuse to feel becomes your destiny. It returns as projection, conflict, and avoidance. You push discomfort away, thinking you are protecting yourself, but you are only reinforcing the trigger. Every escape strengthens the chain. Every retreat makes the next wave stronger. This is why your reactions feel uncontrollable. They have been trained through repetition. You have practiced surrender for years. Schopenhauer believed that most suffering is self-inflicted because people cling to expectations that reality never agreed to meet. This creates a cycle of disappointment that feels like fate but functions like addiction. You keep feeding the emotional patterns that drain your strength. You allow anxiety to narrate your days. You let anger choose your words. You let insecurity dictate your ambition. Each of these is an emotional trap, engineered not by the world, but by the mind you never disciplined. Stoicism does not teach you to suppress emotions. It teaches you to strip their authority. When you detach interpretation from sensation, emotion loses its power to command you. It becomes information rather than instruction. An unbreakable mind does not eliminate fear, it refuses to obey it. That is the pivot most people never make. Instead of challenging the pattern, they wait for it to disappear on its own. It never does. The ego does not shout, it whispers. It convinces you that your reactions are justified, that your desires are truths, that your fears are warnings instead of distortions. Epictetus warned that the greatest chains are the ones you put on yourself while believing you are free. Kierkegaard called the ego a sickness of the self, a refusal to align with who you actually are. Nietzsche went further, exposing the ego as the architect of every illusion that keeps a person small. What breaks your mind is not external pressure. It is the ego's constant demand that reality confirm your expectations. The ego wants control without discipline. It wants validation without effort. It wants certainty in a world built on uncertainty. And when the world refuses to obey, the ego interprets this as injustice. That is why frustration hits you so hard, not because life is unfair, but because the ego insists it should not be this way. Every emotional collapse begins with this internal claim. You think you are hurt by events, but you are actually hurt by the gap between your expectations and the truth. Psychology maps the same pattern. The ego manufactures narratives to protect your identity, even when that identity is hurting you. If you believe you are fragile, it will seek evidence to confirm it. If you believe you are superior, it will distort reality to maintain the illusion. If you believe you are unworthy, it will sabotage opportunities that contradict the story. The ego prefers consistency over growth. It would rather keep you predictable than make you strong. Jung described the ego as a narrow surface of consciousness floating above a vast interior you refuse to explore. That refusal is the birthplace of self-destruction. The parts of you you do not integrate return as fear, envy, anger, and self-betrayal. The ego hides these pieces to protect your comfort, but comfort is the enemy of truth. Frankl insisted that meaning is forged under pressure, never in safety. The ego avoids pressure, so the ego avoids meaning. An unbreakable mind requires a direct attack on egoic illusions. You must question every belief that makes you reactive. You must doubt every entitlement you carry. You must confront every story you repeat to avoid responsibility. Without this confrontation, nothing in you changes. The ego will continue to build the same trap, and you will continue to fall into it, believing it is fate. Strength is not built in comfort. Strength is built in the moments you try hardest to escape. This is the law Musonius Rufus repeated relentlessly. Discomfort is not an interruption of your development, it is the requirement for it. Yet modern minds treat discomfort as a malfunction, as if psychological pain were evidence that something is wrong. Frankl dismantled this idea by proving that suffering becomes destructive only when it is meaningless. When pain has purpose, it transforms. When pain is avoided, it multiplies. You do not become unbreakable by adding ease. You become unbreakable by entering the terrain your ego fears. Discomfort exposes the gap between who you think you are and who you actually are. It strips away the illusions the ego built to shield you from truth. It forces you to meet yourself without the distractions you use to stay numb. Most people interpret this confrontation as failure. They think difficulty means they are not ready. In reality, difficulty is the training ground life uses to prepare you for anything worth having. Schopenhauer argued that the will is strengthened only through friction. Without resistance, the mind decays. Without pressure, the inner structure remains soft. Yet society convinces you that the goal is stability, safety, emotional protection at all costs. The result is a generation of minds incapable of carrying their own weight. Stoicism rejects this softness. It insists that the mind must be trained under stress in the same way a muscle must be torn to grow. Controlled discomfort is not a threat. It is the path. Psychology echoes this. Exposure rewires fear. Confrontation dissolves avoidance. Repetition under pressure creates resilience. Every time you endure discomfort consciously, you expand the size of the self you can handle. Every time you retreat, you shrink it. This is the decision you make every single day without noticing. You either choose the stimulus that strengthens you or the comfort that weakens you. And weakness accumulated over time becomes a collapse that feels sudden only to those who never examined its origin. The principle is simple. You must train your mind to step toward what hurts instead of away from it. You must stop waiting to feel ready. You must stop negotiating with fear. Discomfort is not your enemy, it is your instructor. A mind built for comfort collapses under the first real test. A mind built for pressure expands in the presence of chaos. This is the divide between ordinary people and those who become psychologically unbreakable. Rewiring your mind begins by dismantling the false assumption that emotion equals truth. It does not. Emotion is a signal. Interpretation is the mechanism that turns it into strength or weakness. Epictetus warned that it is not events that disturb you, but your judgments about them. Cognitive psychology confirms this. The brain reacts to interpretation before it reacts to reality. Change the interpretation, and you change the entire trajectory of your response. The first step is perceptual detachment. You observe the emotion without merging with it. This creates space, and in that space logic returns. Jung called this the separation between the ego and the self. The moment you stop obeying the unconscious patterns running your life. The second step is reframing pressure as training instead of threat. When the mind sees difficulty as preparation, fear loses command. The nervous system shifts from panic to engagement. You stop asking why this is happening to you and start asking what this moment demands of you. The third step is behavioral repetition. The mind changes through action, not intention. Every time you respond to stress with clarity instead of surrender, you carve a new neural path. This is how resilience is formed. Not through inspiration, but through the slow demolition of old habits. Schopenhauer claimed that a person becomes free only when they stop reacting blindly to internal impulses. Modern psychology calls this inhibitory control. Stoicism calls it mastery of the ruling faculty. Both point to the same transformation. You become the one who chooses the next move instead of being dragged by instinct. The final step is voluntary exposure. You deliberately place yourself in controlled discomfort to normalize pressure. This is the training ground of every disciplined mind. Frankl demonstrated that meaning strengthens the mind more than comfort ever could. When you step into difficulty intentionally, the ego loses its power to frame pain as defeat. Stress becomes stimulus. Uncertainty becomes data. Instead of shrinking, you adapt. Rewiring your mind is not a philosophy, it is a practice. If you apply these mechanisms, pressure stops being an enemy and becomes the force that shapes you into something rare. An unbreakable mind is not a calm mind, it is a disciplined one. Calm can be faked, discipline cannot. When a person reaches this state, the markers are unmistakable. They no longer negotiate with their emotions, they direct them. They do not wait for motivation, they act from principle. Marcus Aurelius called this the ruling faculty, the inner command center that remains steady while everything around it shifts. Fromm described it as the transition from reactive existence to active authorship. It is the moment a person stops being shaped by life and begins shaping their response to it. The unbreakable mind carries itself with a strange kind of stillness. Not silence, but stability. Fear appears, but it does not dictate. Doubt arises, but it does not define. Pressure intensifies, but it does not fracture the structure. This is not emotional suppression, it is emotional integration. Jung taught that strength begins when the unconscious stops hijacking the conscious. In this state, you understand your impulses without becoming enslaved by them. You recognize your shadow without allowing it to sabotage your direction. Another trait is radical responsibility. No outsourcing of blame, no fantasies about luck or external rescue. Schopenhauer said that clarity begins when excuses end. The unbreakable mind accepts that everything internal is its jurisdiction. This level of responsibility removes the friction that weak minds drown in. When you remove blame, you remove hesitation. When you remove hesitation, action becomes clean, and clean action compounds. This type of mind also holds a deep indifference to chaos. Not apathy, but mastery. External disorder loses its ability to invade the internal environment. Stoic resilience is not numbness, it is sovereignty. It is the recognition that life's volatility cannot touch the core unless you open the door. When you build a mind around principle instead of preference, you stop being vulnerable to every fluctuation around you. Finally, the unbreakable mind is built through repetition of courage. Not grand acts, but daily confrontations with the tasks, truths, and discomforts you once avoided. Frankl insisted that meaning gives a person strength beyond their immediate conditions. Once meaning becomes your anchor, chaos becomes manageable, and suffering becomes directional. The question now is not whether this state exists, You are hearing it described. The question is whether you are willing to strip away the parts of yourself that cannot survive it. This is the moment every previous chapter was leading you toward. Not inspiration, not motivation, decision. A final confrontation between the mind you have and the mind you claim to want. Every teaching from Aurelius, every warning from Seneca, every psychological insight from Jung points to the same threshold. A person becomes unbreakable only when they stop negotiating with themselves. Strength is not built through knowledge. It is built through the refusal to return to the version of you that collapsed under pressure. You already know why your mind breaks. You have seen the traps, the illusions, the egoic machinery you kept feeding. You have seen how discomfort shapes you, how pressure reveals you, how perception either builds or destroys you. Now the question becomes unavoidable. If you do not take command of your inner world, who will? Life will not wait for you to feel ready. Circumstance will not soften because you are overwhelmed. The world moves with or without your stability, and every day you delay this transformation, the cost rises. Kierkegaard wrote that despair begins when a person refuses to be themselves. That refusal is subtle. It hides in excuses, distractions, emotional impulsivity, the quiet hope that discipline can be postponed without consequence. But consequence does not negotiate. Nietzsche understood this when he wrote that the self is not something you discover, but something you create through will. Creation requires sacrifice. To build an unbreakable mind, you must let the weaker layers die. The ego will resist. It always does. It fears accountability because accountability destroys illusion. Psychology reinforces this final truth. Change does not happen when you understand a new idea. Change happens when you stop returning to the old pattern. The neural pathways that keep you fragile only survive if you continue feeding them. Withhold that fuel and the structure collapses. Replace it with disciplined action and a new identity emerges. This is not philosophy, it is biology. The self rewires through repetition, not intention. So here you stand, facing the only choice that ever mattered. Continue living as a consequence of your impulses, or become the architect of your inner world. Continue collapsing under discomfort, or use discomfort as the resistance that forges your strength. Continue defending the version of you that life keeps breaking, or step into the version that does not fracture under pressure. This decision defines everything that follows. If you cross this threshold, you do not become invincible. You become responsible. You become deliberate. You become someone life does not bend easily. An unbreakable mind is not gifted. It is claimed, and the moment you claim it is always now. This is the moment every previous chapter was leading you toward. Not inspiration, not motivation, decision. A final confrontation between the mind you have and the mind you claim to want. Every teaching from Aurelius, every warning from Seneca, every psychological insight from Jung points to the same threshold. A person becomes unbreakable only when they stop negotiating with themselves. Strength is not built through knowledge. It is built through the refusal to return to the version of you that collapsed under pressure. You already know why your mind breaks. You have seen the traps, the illusions, the egoic machinery you kept feeding. You have seen how discomfort shapes you, how pressure reveals you, how perception either builds or destroys you. Now the question becomes unavoidable. If you do not take command of your inner world, who will? Life will not wait for you to feel ready. Circumstance will not soften because you are overwhelmed. The world moves with or without your stability, and every day you delay this transformation, the cost rises. Kierkegaard wrote that despair begins when a person refuses to be themselves. That refusal is subtle. It hides in excuses, distractions, emotional impulsivity, the quiet hope that discipline can be postponed without consequence. But consequence does not negotiate. Nietzsche understood this when he wrote that the self is not something you discover, but something you create through will. Creation requires sacrifice. To build an unbreakable mind, you must let the weaker layers die. The ego will resist. It always does. It fears accountability because accountability destroys illusion. Psychology reinforces this final truth. Change does not happen when you understand a new idea. Change happens when you stop returning to the old pattern. The neural pathways that keep you fragile only survive if you continue feeding them. Withhold that fuel and the structure collapses. Replace it with disciplined action and a new identity emerges. This is not philosophy, it is biology. The self rewires through repetition, not intention. So here you stand, facing the only choice that ever mattered. Continue living as a consequence of your impulses or become the architect of your inner world. Continue collapsing under discomfort or use discomfort as the resistance that forges your strength. Continue defending the version of you that life keeps breaking, or step into the version that does not fracture under pressure. This decision defines everything that follows. If you cross this threshold, you do not become invincible. You become responsible. You become deliberate. You become someone life does not bend easily. An unbreakable mind is not gifted. It is claimed. And the moment you claim it is always now. The Stoic iron mind speaks with clarity, not cruelty. It cuts illusions, not people.